Our stomach is a temporary storage tank for the bolus, or the bulli that arrive in it. It physically churns the food, chemically degrades the food, and that bolus gets converted to a paste-like material called chyme at that point. So the stomach has 50 milliliter volume, but it could expand from 50 to 4,000 milliliters, which is 4 liters. When the stomach is empty, it forms many folds called rugae, which I'll show you on the next picture. There's all those little rugae, so this is where that the esophageal sphincter was located. So this entry point in the stomach is the cardia, the proximal end of the stomach is the fundus, main part is the body, and then the stomach tapers near the distal end to form the pylorus, or the pyloric canal, at which point we have another sphincter at the distal end called the pyloric sphincter, which is a valve that prevents backflow of material or chyme. So when it flows into the small intestine, the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, it cannot regurgitate back into the stomach. We can see the stomach has 3 smooth muscle layers instead of 2, so there's an oblique layer in addition to the circular and longitudinal layer, and this is the lesser curvature of the stomach, which is a tighter curve, where the longer curvature is the greater curvature. And the stomach, like all alimentary canal organs, will consist of the 4 tunics, or layers. The muscularis externa, we saw in the previous slide on the image that it has that extra oblique layer of muscle that allows the stomach to churn, mix, move chyme, to pummel it, to break material down. The mucosa layer, or the inner layer, is simple columnar, as is typical with the alimentary canal, but it's composed of mucus cells, entirely of mucus cells. That gives us a 2-layer coat of mucus, alkaline or basic mucus, and this is important. So those 2 layers, you have a surface layer, it's viscous, very thick, insoluble, and that traps a bicarbonate-rich fluid layer of mucus beneath it. Bicarbonate is what makes it alkaline, because this mucus is going to neutralize the acid, that acidic environment, because this lining would wear away, or the tissue would wear away with the acidic environment of the stomach, but thanks to that thick mucus double layer, alkaline mucus double layer, that protects the underlying stomach mucosa. Now the esophagus doesn't have that thick mucus layer, which is why we get acid reflux or GERD's disease, because the acid will wear away at other areas of the alimentary canal. So this mucosa layer, of course, these are simple columnar cells. These are all mucus cells, and we'll see that the mucosa layer dips deep very often, and these are called gastric pits. And these gastric pits have gastric glands located within them. And most of the glands are in the fundus and the body of the stomach. That's where most of the gastric juice is created as well. So glands include secretory cells. So let's look at the 4 types, and we'll describe them individually. Of course, these are all mucus-producing cells, but these are mucus-producing cells as well in the gland, and they're called mucus neck cells. We have parietal cells in these pits. Even deeper, we have these purple, illustrated here, chief cells, and located deep in the pit as well in green, they're showing here, enteroendocrine cells. So our job now is to go through these 4 types of cells in the glands to determine what their function is. So we'll run real quickly through them. Mucus neck cells, they actually secrete acidic mucus, different than all the other mucus cells in the mucosa. Not sure why. It says unknown function of this acidic mucus. But let's go to the parietal cells. We can see the parietal cells. They're showing them in blue here. They're going to secrete something very important. Well, 2 things. One is hydrochloric acid. which has an extremely low pH, and that's going to continue with the digestion process. Remember, the salivary glands started it, but that salivary glands only started the digestion with some starch. That was the salivary amylase. But now, with the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, it's going to denature proteins. It's going to activate pepsin, which we'll become familiar with very shortly. Also breaks down plant cell walls, kills many bacteria, so we have this hydrochloric acidic environment in the stomach which digests a lot of material here. But also these parietal cells that we see labeled right there secrete intrinsic factor. It's a glycoprotein, and we need that to absorb vitamin B12, which has an important function in iron, and of course we know iron and hemoglobin are important for red blood cell production, which of course is essential for life. The chief cells, which we see in purple down in the pits, secrete two products as well. Pepsinogen. When something ends in a ogen or gen, that usually means it's in an inactive form. So pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme, but recall on the previous slide that hydrochloric acid activates pepsin. So basically hydrochloric acid will activate pepsinogen to become pepsin, so pepsin can perform its job. Actually, pepsin itself will activate pepsinogen into pepsin. That's a positive feedback mechanism. We haven't really talked about what pepsin does yet, but we will. And lipases, which will digest lipids, at least 15 or so % of them. Actually, it doesn't hurt to mention, now that we've said it a few times, pepsin is also going to break down proteins or polypeptides or strings of amino acid, maybe not quite a protein, but yeah, pepsin breaks down proteins as well. The enteroendocrine cells, which we see in green, very few of them, and deep in the pits, secrete chemical messengers into the lamina propria. Remember, the lamina propria is part of the inner mucosal layer. Lamina propria is a sublayer that has capillaries. So these chemical messengers can enter the lamina propria into the blood. They can act as paracrines, which means affect nearby tissue, like serotonin and histamine. Somatostatin and gastrin are hormones that can have effect on other tissue. Of course, somatostatin can be a paracrine as well as a hormone. So we're going to see what some of these do once we get a little further along. So before we move on, let's look at the mucosal barrier, which I began to mention a little earlier. Conditions inside the stomach are acidic, they're very harsh. The stomach cells themselves need to be protected, so we have this mucosal barrier. And it protects the stomach in three ways. One that I mentioned, that thick layer of bicarbonate to neutralize the acid. Bicarbonate-rich mucus is on the stomach wall. Between the epithelial cells and the mucosa, we have tight junctions, so therefore this acidic juice can't seep between cells and enter underlying tissues. When cells are damaged in the epithelium of the stomach, they're replaced very quickly by cell division of stem cells that are located in the epithelium of the stomach. A few conditions involving the stomach. One is gastritis, inflammation of the stomach wall, when anything that breaches the stomach's mucosal barrier will cause that inflammation. Gastritis, a peptic ulcer, or a gastric ulcer, that's more specific, involving the stomach. That's when the stomach wall starts to erode. Ulcers can be caused by a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. Can also be caused by NSAIDs, anti-inflammatory medications or drugs such as aspirin. So we know the stomach is a holding area for food. Digestive processes are carried out by the stomach. Here are the four that are involved, where the stomach is involved in. So the stomach performs all four of these functions. Propulsion through peristalsis, wave-like muscle contraction, moves food along the tract. There's mechanical breakdown, also through peristalsis, and by stomach churning, which pulverizes food and breaks it apart. Digestion, that's when material is denatured. Denatured proteins, in the case of the stomach, by hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Those are two of our, well, one is an enzyme, the other is acid that helps break down proteins that we take in. And not much absorption takes place in the stomach. That's reserved for the small intestine, but there are a few things that can be absorbed in from the stomach, like alcohol and aspirin.